Welcome to Trust Talk. Our guest today is Professor Benjamin Ho, a professor of economics at Vassar College and author of the book Why Trust Matters, an economist's guide to the ties that bind us. He talks about the role of game theory to explain human interactions. We explore the challenges of cooperation and the importance of reputation, prior interactions, and patience. We'll delve into the crucial role of risk and vulnerability in building trust, and how apologies can serve as signals of trustworthiness. We'll travel through time, exploring the evolution of cooperation from early hunter-gatherer societies to the intricate web of trust woven by modern-day institutions like religion and the rule of law. We take a deep dive into the intriguing trade-offs between likability and respect when apologies are at stake, and how transparency and relationships can shape trust in global issues such as climate change. Finally, we'll delve into the delicate balance between security and vulnerability in contractual relationships, unveiling the secrets to fostering trust. Your host today, Severin DeWitt.
Welcome to Trust Talk, Ben. I'm thrilled to have you on the show. I've done a lot of interviews on the topic of trust, but I'm especially excited about this one because of your book, Why Trust Matters. I have to tell you, I've added over 47 post-it notes to the pages with comments, questions and exclamation marks, that if we were to cover them all, we'd need more than the 30 minutes we have for this podcast, but I loved the book. So, before we start talking about trust, tell us a little bit about your background and how you got to where you are today.
Oh, sure. I've been a little bit all over the place. I went to college at Stanford and MIT, where I studied 7 degrees in a variety of fields, mostly in engineering, but also economics, math, computer science, political science, education. So a bit all over the place. I think a big part of my research is bringing together ideas from different disciplines. So a lot of my research is bringing together ideas from sociology, anthropology, psychology, philosophy even, to study questions like trust and inequality and even climate change. And so I've worked in a variety of industries. I've worked briefly in finance and for the White House. And after teaching at Cornell in the business school for a while, I came to Vassar College, where I've been for the past 12 years now.
As an economist who originally focused on the theoretical modeling of human behavior, what inspired you to write a book specifically about trust?
I got started in graduate school. I was trying to pick a topic for my dissertation, and I was faced with this daunting task because to do a dissertation, you have to do research that nobody's ever done before, right? That nobody in the history of the world has thought of these ideas. And the questions I was really interested in, like how to solve poverty and how to create growth, were basically just already studied by really, really smart people. And I was like, what else could I add to that? And so it just so happened that at the time, my roommate asked me this question about a friend that kept showing up late for meetings and kept apologizing. And he said, Ben, what's the point of apologies? Why do people say, I am sorry? And I thought, oh, that's interesting. I bet economics can answer that question. And it turns out that we apologize to restore trust. There's this new field of trust economics that had just sort of started in the 1990s. So I thought, great, I'm a game theorist, I run experiments, and I applied those tools to understand how apologies restore trust, and I've been basically studying trust ever since.
Yeah, we come to that apology later on in the interview. But first, can you explain the key insights from economic theory that help us understand the mechanisms underlying trust and how they apply to our daily interactions with others?
Yeah, that's a great question. I draw very much from game theory. My original training was game theory, which is basically using mathematics to explain the interactions around us. One of the key ideas of game theory is this idea of repeated games, where humans often face cooperative dilemmas, where we want to cooperate with each other, but people have a temptation to shirk, to basically do the wrong thing that harms cooperation. And a lot of that early research was about introducing this idea of if we always think of ourselves as playing in repeated interactions over and over again, how does that change our cooperative behavior? And it turns out that in that case, we start caring about reputation more. Our history of prior interactions start mattering, and patience matters more. And so using those ideas was the first step into modeling this kind of behavior. The other thing that happens in these repeated games is risk. And a big part of trust in my book is thinking about risk and vulnerability. That it's funny that we think of risk as a bad thing, but one thing that my book shows is that risk is also an essential ingredient to creating trust. If we basically don't have any risk, if we don't have any chance of being vulnerable with somebody else, then we don't have the chance to demonstrate how trustworthy we are, and trust is harder to build. And then the final contribution, I think, from economic theory to understanding trust is something from statistics, which is called Bayes' rule. In economics and biology, we have these ideas of social signaling. I think the easiest way to think about signaling is thinking about peacocks. Right, so everybody knows that peacocks grow these very elaborate tail feathers to sort of demonstrate their evolutionary fitness. So economists have taken that idea to think about how other people signal using different mechanisms to demonstrate something about themselves. I'm very much interested in how people demonstrate their trustworthiness. And my research into apologies is basically thinking about how apologies serve as a signal of your trustworthiness, and how we can use mathematics of Bayes' rule and probability and statistics to basically understand how those signals work.
You just talked about game theory and experiments. As an economist, how do you reconcile the traditional economic analysis that predicts a breakdown in trust with the fact that trust happens all the time in both experiments and real-world situations?
It's interesting, right? Because for a long time, it puzzled economists why people are cooperative, why people are ever altruistic. It's funny because this is not a puzzle to anybody else, right? Everybody realizes that they see cooperation all the time, but for a long time, this was a dilemma for economic theory because in our baseline economic model, where everyone is this rational, self-interested actor, cooperation's strange. And you still see this in experimental data, right? Or even when I'm just sort of talking about my book, I sort of do a sample experiment in lectures. I sort of use the trust game experiment, and it turns out that most people cooperate in these games. The exception is economists, right? That there's actually research that shows that people with more and more economics training, they tend to often take the uncooperative route, the more selfish route. I think it's not because economists are selfish people necessarily. It's just that economic theory teaches that you're supposed to be selfish. Human instinct teaches the opposite, right? That we've had millennia of evolution that basically select for cooperative behavior. And that's not to say that economics is useless, right? I think one of my favorite books is by one of my former Cornell colleagues, Robert Frank. The book is called Passion Within Reason, and it basically is trying to say that, okay, yes, baseline economic model predicts selfishness, but we could use that baseline economic model to demonstrate why cooperation is important and better for evolutionary fitness. And he says that by thinking about how those models predict that cooperation is better, we could also make predictions about how evolution, either cultural evolution or biological evolution, will select for those cooperative traits. I think basically we have those cooperative instincts of fairness and altruism built into us, and that is why we see so much cooperation in the world.
In the beginning of your book, you talk about how trust has been an important thing for humans for a really long time. You say that we are naturally wired to trust and that it has helped us build societies over the years. You also talk about how things like religion, markets, and courts have helped us expand our trust beyond just our family and small group. Can you tell us a little bit more about how trust played a role in older civilizations?
That is a very long history to cover, but I will see what I can cover.
Well, in short.
Yeah, of course. I think I start the book thinking about hunter-gatherers. So I think about when humanity just lived in small societies, hunting and gathering for sustenance. And I thought about the dilemma that hunters face when they take down a big animal, and now they need to figure out what to do with all the meat. And this is before there were refrigeration and there's no way to store the meat. And so, of course, it makes sense to share it. But then we have this dilemma as to who to share it with. And ideally, you'd want to share it with somebody who will reciprocate in the future. By sharing with you today, I hope you will share with me in the future. And what you needed was ways to identify who is trustworthy and who is not. And in those early civilizations, a lot of the innovations that sort of make humans what we are were basically to solve that trust problem. that we go back and if we look at the oldest forms of writing that we find, it's not poetry, it's not rule of law, it's accounting. It's basically people keeping track of who owes what to who. And we also find that there's even theories out there by Joseph Henrich and others that say that the reason why we even learned how to talk, why we learn language, is just to keep track of who is trustworthy or not. Trust is so fundamental to being a human that things like speech, things like writing, were all mechanisms designed to help us understand how to trust. And then, of course, we could then fast forward to the future where cooperation gets much more complicated. We're not just trying to cooperate with other people in our little village or in our tribe, but we're learning to cooperate at far larger scales. And that's when institutions of religion show up, institutions like rule of law. They all sort of create rituals and rules that help us identify who is trustworthy and who is not, and how to maintain cooperation across bigger and bigger social groupings.
Moving to another topic related to trust. In your book, you talk about the importance of making a good apology. You mentioned apology earlier, when trust has been broken. And you explain that an apology shows that you are trustworthy, but it has to be a real one, and it can't be done just to take a shortcut. You also mentioned that forgiveness takes time. Maybe you can explain that a little bit and also give us some examples of that.
Sure thing. I think when I talk about apologies with people, they often think about current apologies in the news or current apologies in our current world. I think there's this question of, should Germany have apologized for the Holocaust? Should Japan apologize for things that occurred during World War II, say with American POWs, or how prisoners in China were treated? And it's hard because people think, oh, why don't they just say, I am sorry? Right? That it seems like people often just want a simple apology for things. And it turns out that it's actually much more complicated than that, because we want people to say, I am sorry, but that I am sorry cannot just be words, right? That sorry must come with some kind of penitence, some kind of cost. And when you dig into these stories, you realize that countries often do try to apologize. It just, the apologies, if they don't come with enough cost, they're not accepted. To basically test this, I ran an experiment with the company Uber. Uber is a car service. They have this problem where if they pick you up to give you a ride, if that Uber is late, people naturally are upset. And it turns out that when your Uber ride is late, you are maybe 5% less likely to ever use Uber again. And that's a problem for Uber. I worked with the economists at Uber to design an experiment where we would test different kinds of apologies. And the baseline apology saying, I am sorry, just didn't work, right? It turned out that actually just saying I am sorry was almost worse than not saying anything at all, because it was seen as too cheap. So how do we make the apology more effective? One way to make the apology more effective is to give a coupon along the way. If we apologize and gave Uber customers a $5 coupon to come back, that actually worked pretty well. And we see that that $5 coupon has benefits to maintaining this relationship with the customer, even for the 12 weeks we tracked that relationship. One simple apology and a coupon lasted for 12 weeks. But the cost doesn't have to just be a monetary cost. The cost could also be a promise to do better. So we also tested apologies where Uber said, I'm sorry, and I promise to do better again. And that actually worked very well too. An apology with a promise actually worked really well. And where the cost of the promise comes about is that if I apologize and promise to do better, if I do make another mistake, then you punish me even worse. Customers that received a promise and then Uber screwed up again and your ride was late again, those customers were the most likely to quit using Uber. The point of this is that, yes, apologies do work to restore relationships. And the problem is that even though we want people to apologize, the only apologies that work have to be hard to be effective. They have to be costly to be effective. And the cost has to be proportional to the crime.
Another interesting experiment on apology was done by Larissa Tiedens about Bill Clinton's apologies after the Monica Lewinsky scandal. Can you tell us a bit more about the experiment and what it found? I'm curious to know how the different versions of Clinton's apology affected how people saw him.
Yeah, that's a really fascinating example of this phenomenon too, of how an apology only works if it is costly. I think this is one of my favorite experiments. This is actually by one of my professors who was at Stanford Business School when I was a PhD student, and this is by Laura Tiedens. And what she did was she conducted this experiment near the end of the Bill Clinton administration. Bill Clinton, if you recall, was involved in these sex scandals with an intern at the White House. And there was a big call for Bill Clinton to apologize for these scandals with Monica Lewinsky. At the time, it was often remarked upon that Clinton never did it. Why didn't he just say, I am sorry, right? These are three easy words. In one of my papers, I quote Elton John, who has a song, sorry is the hardest words, or something to those effects. It turns out that saying I am sorry is hard, and this experiment by Tiedens helps document why. And so what Tiedens did was she basically took video clips of Clinton, and she made two different videos. One video, he sounded apologetic for the whole Monica Lewinsky scandal. The other, he just sounded angry, right? He basically sounded like, why are you accusing me of such things? And she showed these two videos to two groups of subjects. And it turns out that people that saw apologetic Clinton, they were happy he apologized. They liked him more. They found him to be a nicer person, a more warm person. But the thing is that people that saw angry Clinton respected him more. They found him to be more competent. And most important for politicians, people that saw angry Clinton were more likely to support him for president again. So there's this idea that if you apologize, I might like you more, but then I respect you less and I'm less likely to vote for you. Whereas if you are just angry, it turns out that people respect you more. So people maybe think you're a less nice person, but oftentimes we're not looking for niceness in our politicians. We're looking for competence. We're looking for authority. This lesson was well understood, I think, in Clinton's time. We saw that Clinton never apologized. I actually started a lot of my research looking at examples like Silvio Berlusconi, who also famously never apologized. And we see politicians today who famously never apologized. And this experiment shows why, right? That apologies have a cost. That cost comes in lost authority, lost respect, lost belief in your competence. The benefit of that cost, right? The reason that it's good that apologies come with this cost is because it does make people like you more. That when you apologize and you're willing to pay that cost, then we see that people sort of like you more. We see stronger relationships in other dimensions.
So let's move to a very relevant topic. I'd like to talk about the Paris Climate Agreement, something completely different. You mentioned that this agreement was unique because it was based entirely on trust. Can you explain more about how trust played a role in this international agreement and how it worked?
Yeah, so this goes back to this theory in game theory of cooperative games. That basically the natural state of cooperative dilemmas is we all have a temptation to do the selfish thing. The ultimate example of a cooperative dilemma is climate change, where if we all work together and cut our CO2 emissions, the world will be a better place. But each country individually has an incentive to not cut their emissions, to not spend the high costs to invest in green technology, and to basically just continue with fossil fuels. Especially because if just one country does it, it's not too bad, right? If every other country in the world does the cooperative thing and invests in green, then it's okay if I shirk my responsibilities and just do the selfish thing. In game theory, we basically argue there's two ways to sort of resolve this dilemma. One way is through coercion. We have the police or some authority say, if you don't cooperate, we will put you in jail, we'll punish you. This doesn't work on the international level, right? There's no international organization that has the authority to get people to cooperate. And then the second way we cooperate in our everyday lives is through trust. Through ethical means, it's through emotions, it's through demonstrating our trustworthiness. I talked earlier about how humans are evolved to care about trust and to care about fairness. But the question is, does that trust apply at the international level? And to some extent, it does, right? To some extent, these rules of human behavior that govern our cooperation actually even work for countries. that if you look at the history of treaties, treaties are all enforced by trust. That countries agree to disarm nuclear weapons, countries agree to free trade, and all of these things are based on reputation and trust and the tools that the tools of game theory provide. I think that's why game theory is powerful. That even though so much of human interaction depends on emotions, game theory also applies to sort of these abstract, maybe highly rational entities like countries, and we could use them to think about them here. So, coming back to climate change, what was interesting about the Paris Climate Accords was that it did not actually impose any rules. It did not impose any coercion. Past attempts at creating climate accords was all about creating rules and systems that forced people to comply with the climate rules. And the Paris Accords actually had a whole different philosophy. Their philosophy was just transparency. Their philosophy was that instead of forcing countries to cut their emissions, we will just ask countries to report their emissions. And the idea there is that by making their emissions more transparent, by having the whole world aware of your emissions, maybe more importantly, having your own population aware of your climate emissions, that will sort of create a system of maybe guilt, of maybe trust, where I basically can see what everyone is doing. And when you can see what everyone is doing, then we can sort of create these positive behaviors where, okay, if I see you are basically doing the right thing for climate change, then maybe that will create incentives for me to do the right thing for climate change in order to create this reciprocal, trusting relationship. And that's why I thought it was kind of fascinating to sort of see that basically it's a new kind of rule of law, one based on transparency and relationships, as opposed to one based on rules and punishment.
Do you think that the way we talk can affect our behavior and decision making when it comes to trust? And if so, what could this mean for economic policies and practices? For instance, could the words we use impact how we build and keep trust in business relationship, or affect how willing we are to take risks when trusting others in economic deals?
Yeah, that's a deep question, right? That reminds me of lectures I attended with like Noam Chomsky and linguistics and philosophy about how the words we use shape our thought patterns. I think it's a great question. For sure, it matters. But interestingly, in my own research, I find it's not the words themselves that matter the most. Oftentimes, the term we use in game theory is that words are cheap talk. It's the cost behind those words, right? I talked earlier about effective apologies. And it turns out that no matter how beautifully crafted your apology is, it actually doesn't work if there's no cost associated with it. That doesn't mean that the words don't matter. I think the words sort of shape the cost. And what I mean is that when I think about apologies, I and linguists and others have classified apologies into four different categories. The cheapest apologies are basically an empathy apology. I am sorry, I recognize your pain, that takes no responsibility. The other cheapest apology is basically just an excuse, right? I'm sorry, but it wasn't my fault. Those are very low cost, bad apologies. Good apologies are costly apologies. The two sort of better apologies are a promise apology. I'm sorry, I won't do it again. This is very much the basis of our experiment with Uber. And then a status apology. I'm sorry, I am an idiot, or I'm sorry, I am incompetent. This is very much the case of the experiment with Bill Clinton. And so, in that sense, the words we used for how we apologize do matter very much, but it's not the words themselves, it's that these words come with implicit promises. It's that these words come with admissions of your own fallibility. And it's the tangible, it's how these words affect our beliefs about you in other areas that make them effective at restoring trust.
Let's talk about a subject that you also cover in the book, and that's important to me since I've worked in law for most of my career: trust and contracts. When it comes to economic transactions, how do you think trust and contract enforcement work together? Do they support and strengthen each other, or do they compete with one another and possibly get in the way?
I've done research on this question because there is this contrast in the trust literature between two different ways to study the relationship between trust and contracts. One way to study the relationship between trust and contracts is the macro historical way. And what they do is they look at the history of human civilization. They go back hundreds of years, thousands of years, and they look at countries or societies that have a lot of trust, have high trust or low trust, and countries and societies that have strong rule of law, strong contract enforcement versus weak rule of law and weak contract enforcement. And it seems like trust and contract enforcement go together, right? It seems like countries that have high trust also have good contracts. Countries with good contracts also have high trust. But there is also a contrasting literature that's done through experiments. And the way these experiments work is we basically bring students into a laboratory and we put them into situations. We have them play games from game theory. And there we find that contracts can actually interfere with trust. And what we see is that a contract that puts in too many rules takes out the chance to being vulnerable. It takes away the chance to take a risk on somebody else. Too many rules actually reduces the chance for players to build trust with each other, and it's actually bad. And so the way we reconcile these ideas is that we think that we do need some kind of rule of law and contracts to help start a relationship. In order to take a risk on somebody, you basically need a baseline level of security, a baseline level of guarantee that the relationship will go okay. But after that, you want to have some room for vulnerability. I spoke to a lot of lawyers who write contracts, and you see also the same in the economic literature, and you often find that oftentimes contracts are incomplete, that they leave things out in certain places to give flexibility to the parties, but also to give the parties the opportunity to demonstrate that they're trustworthy. Because if we just specify too much in the rules, we never give a chance for people to demonstrate trustworthiness. And if you don't give a chance to demonstrate trustworthiness, then you basically don't have the chance to build trust.
Well, I have a final question, a question I normally ask all my interviewees. I'm also asking to you. What advice would you give to young economists regarding their research and study to ensure that the topics of economics and trust are explored in a way that yields insights for policymakers?
I think the best advice I have is to not take trust for granted. I think all of us know that trust is important. We see trust everywhere in our day-to-day lives. And yet when I talk to students and I ask them, have you ever talked about trust in your classes? The answer is almost always no. You could do several degrees in economics, take many classes in economics, and the concept of trust never comes up. And this is especially important if you're thinking about economic development. I said earlier that when I started graduate school, I really wanted to solve the problems of poverty, right? I really wanted to solve the problems of developing countries and impoverished areas in developed countries. And it turns out that a lot of those problems are occurring because they lack the institutions of trust that we take for granted in the developed world. Right, that we've had millennia to develop institutions like rule of law, like religion, like social norms that basically make our economic transactions function. What we often think of capitalism as cold-hearted, but it turns out that in these anthropological studies, these capitalist economies often exhibit the most trust in these trust game situations. And it turns out that we can't forget about that when establishing new institutions elsewhere. If we're worried about poverty, if we're worried about economic development, we need to make sure that the institutions that establish trust are also there in order for anything to work.
Ben, thank you for joining us today, and I wish you all the best and good health, and I hope you have many more readers of this fantastic book you wrote.
Thank you so much. I'm glad you enjoyed it.
Absolutely.
Thank you for joining us for another episode of Trust Talk. We hope that you found the conversation valuable and informative. At Trust Talk, we believe in the power of trust to create positive change in the world. If you believe in our mission, we would greatly appreciate your support. You can help keep Trust Talk going by making a donation on our website at trusttalk.co/donate. Every contribution, no matter how small, helps us to continue bringing you thoughtful and engaging podcasts. Thank you for your support and for listening to Trust Talk. We look forward to meeting you again for future episodes.